The flight was supposed to be routine. Nothing special. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another red-eye from one city to the next, the kind of flight you forget about the moment you step off the jet bridge and feel the cool terminal air hit your face. That was the plan, anyway. Board. Sit down. Eat. Sleep. Land. Move on. But that is not what happened. Let me take you back to the beginning, because every detail matters. Every small moment, every glance, every decision that was made on that aircraft, it all led to something none of us expected. And by the time that plane touched down, the people responsible for what happened were standing in complete and total silence. It had already been one of those days. The kind that starts too early and stretches too long. I had been traveling since before sunrise. 2 connecting flights. A 3-hour layover in a city I had no interest in visiting. My phone was dying. My back ached from sitting in cramped economy seats for the first 2 legs of the journey. And by the time I reached my final departure gate, I was running on fumes. But there was one thing keeping me going. This last flight, the final leg, was in first class. Now, let me be clear about something. I am not someone who flies first class regularly. This was not a luxury I was accustomed to. It was a rare upgrade, one I had earned through months of accumulated miles and a stroke of good timing at the check-in counter. And honestly, after the day I had been through, it felt like the universe was finally throwing me a small win. So when I walked down that jet bridge and turned left instead of right, left, toward the wide seats, the soft lighting, the quiet hum of a cabin designed for comfort, I felt something close to relief. Not excitement. Just relief. Like the day was finally going to end on a decent note. The cabin was calm. There were maybe 12 seats in first class. Wide, leather seats with adjustable headrests and thick armrests. Each one had a small pillow resting against the window and a folded blanket draped over the cushion. The overhead lighting was dim, casting a warm amber glow across the rows. A few passengers had already settled in. One was reading a newspaper. Another had noise-canceling headphones on, eyes closed, seemingly already halfway to sleep. A woman across the aisle was arranging her belongings in the seat pocket ahead of her. It was peaceful. I placed my carry-on in the overhead bin, slid into my seat, buckled my seatbelt, and exhaled. The kind of exhale that comes after hours of tension. The kind that says, finally. This is where the day gets better. The doors closed. The safety demonstration played. The aircraft taxied to the runway. And within a few minutes, we were airborne. Through the window, I watched the city lights shrink below us. Tiny glowing grids giving way to dark stretches of open land. Then clouds. Then nothing but the quiet hum of the engines and the soft rush of air moving over the fuselage. It felt like the perfect end to a long day. About 30 minutes after takeoff, the meal service began. Now, if you have never flown in first class before, let me explain what this looks like. It is not like economy, where a small tray with a sealed container is placed on your fold-down table. In first class, it is an experience. The flight attendants move through the cabin with purpose. White linen cloths are laid down first. Then the tray. Then the appetizer. Then the entree. Warm bread is offered from a basket. Drinks are refreshed. It is deliberate, personal, and it happens one row at a time. And that is exactly what started happening around me. The passengers in the front rows received their meals first. I could see the white linen trays being placed carefully. The soft clink of real silverware, not plastic, but actual metal forks and knives. I could smell the food. Something warm and rich. Something with herbs and butter. The kind of aroma that makes your stomach tighten with anticipation, especially when you have not eaten properly all day. One by one, each row received their meals. Row 1. Row 2. Row 3. Quiet thank yous filled the cabin. The soft sounds of people beginning to eat. A fork against a plate. The tear of warm bread. Ice shifting in a glass. And then the cart reached my row. Except it did not stop. The flight attendant, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, uniform crisp, expression professional, moved the cart past my row without so much as a glance in my direction. At first, I did not think anything of it. Maybe I was next. Maybe they were working from the other side. Maybe the service would loop back around. So I waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. Passengers behind me began receiving their meals. The row ahead had already started eating. The gentleman to my left, a man in a tailored suit who had barely looked up from his laptop since boarding, was carefully cutting into a piece of chicken with a serrated knife. Everyone around me was eating. Everyone except me. Now, you might be thinking, just press the call button. Just ask. And you are right. That is exactly what I did. I pressed the small overhead button, and a soft chime echoed through the cabin. A few seconds later, the same flight attendant who had passed my row appeared at my side. She was polite. Professional. Her smile was measured and practiced. I kept my voice low. Calm. I told her that I had not yet received my meal and asked if there had been some kind of delay. What she said next changed the entire atmosphere of that flight. She glanced down at a printed sheet, a service list clipped to a small board, and without any hesitation, without any apology, without any indication that what she was about to say was anything unusual, she told me something that made absolutely no sense. According to her list, I was not scheduled to receive a meal. Not scheduled. Let me repeat that. I was sitting in a first-class seat. I had a confirmed first-class ticket. I was surrounded by other first-class passengers, all of whom had just been served warm, beautifully plated meals. And according to the flight attendant standing beside me, I was not supposed to receive one. The moment hung in the air like smoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not react with anger. But I could feel something shift inside me, a quiet, uncomfortable feeling that something was very, very wrong here. And I was not the only one who felt it. Because when the flight attendant said those words, several passengers nearby looked up from their plates. Not dramatically. Not with wide eyes or gasps. But with that slow, quiet turn of the head that people do when they hear something that does not sound right. The man in the suit paused mid-bite. The woman across the aisle lowered her glass. And in that brief, shared moment, everyone within earshot seemed to arrive at the same unspoken question. Why was every first-class passenger served a meal except one? And by the time that plane landed, the crew suddenly went silent. But we are not there yet. Not even close. Because what happened between that moment and the landing is a story that needs to be told slowly. Carefully. With every detail in place. So stay with me. Because this is only the beginning. And I want you to think about something as we continue. Think about the last time you were in a situation where you were told no, not for a reason, not because of a rule that applied to everyone equally, but for a reason that no one could articulate. A no that felt personal. A no that felt targeted. A no that made you look around the room and realize that whatever was happening to you was not happening to anyone else. Hold that feeling. Because you are going to need it to understand what comes next. See, the thing about being denied something you were promised is that it does not hit you all at once. It arrives in stages. The first stage is confusion, the simple, almost innocent belief that there must be a misunderstanding. Then comes the slow, creeping realization that the misunderstanding might not be a misunderstanding at all. That the person telling you no actually means no. And then comes the part that most people do not talk about. The part where you look around and see that no one else received that no. Just you. Only you. And in that moment, the question shifts from what happened to why me. That question, why me, is the one that followed me for the rest of that flight. It sat beside me like a passenger in the empty seat. It whispered in my ear every time I looked at the plates and glasses and linen cloths surrounding me. It grew louder every time a flight attendant walked past without meeting my eyes. Why me? 2 words. No answer. And when a question that simple goes unanswered for long enough, it stops being a question. It becomes a feeling. A feeling that settles into your chest and your stomach in the backs of your eyes, and it stays there, not because you want it to, but because no one has given you a reason to let it go. That is where we are heading. Into the feeling. Into the silence. Into the part of this story where the lights dim and the cabin goes quiet and the only thing louder than the engines is the question that no one will answer. But first, let me take you back. Back to the beginning of the day. Back to the hours before I boarded that flight. Because to truly understand what happened at 35,000 feet, you need to understand the journey that led me there. To understand what happened on that flight, you need to understand the day that came before it. Because nothing happens in isolation. Every moment is connected to the one before it, and the tension that built inside that first-class cabin did not appear out of nowhere. It had roots. It had context. And the context begins long before I ever stepped foot on that aircraft. The morning started at 4:15. Not by choice. My alarm went off in a hotel room I had barely slept in. The kind of budget hotel near the airport where the walls are thin, the air conditioner rattles, and the pillows are just slightly too flat. I had checked in the night before after arriving late from a work trip, knowing I had an early departure. 4:15. The room was dark. My eyes burned. I lay there for a full minute, staring at the ceiling, convincing myself to move. Then I did. Shower. Dress. Bag already packed from the night before. Down to the lobby. No breakfast, the restaurant did not open until 6. Just a paper cup of weak coffee from the machine near the front desk and a granola bar I had saved from my last flight. That was my breakfast. A stale granola bar and lukewarm coffee at 4:45 in the morning. Keep that in mind. It becomes important later. The shuttle to the airport took 20 minutes. The terminal was already humming with activity by the time I arrived. Long lines at security. Families with strollers. Business travelers with their rolling bags and rigid postures. The constant drone of announcements overhead. Gate changes, boarding calls, final calls, an endless loop of information that blurs into background noise after a while. My first flight was a short hop. Regional jet. Economy seat near the back. No meal service. No beverage service beyond a cup of water that was handed to me while we were still on the ground. The flight lasted about 90 minutes, and by the time we landed at the connecting airport, my legs were stiff and my stomach was already growling. I had a 3-hour layover. 3 hours in an airport. Now, for some people, that is fine. Some people enjoy airports. They browse the shops. They sit at the bar and watch sports on the overhead screens. They people watch. But when you have been up since 4:15 and you have already been through security once and flown on a cramped regional jet and you know you still have 2 more flights ahead of you, 3 hours feels like a very long time. I found a seat near my next gate. Hard plastic chair. The kind that is designed to be durable, not comfortable. I sat there with my bag between my feet and tried to eat something. A sandwich from one of the terminal shops. It was fine. Forgettable. The kind of food you eat because you need to, not because you want to. My second flight was longer. About 3 hours. Another economy seat, this time in the middle of a row. Window seat occupied by a man who fell asleep before takeoff and did not move the entire flight. Aisle seat occupied by a woman who got up 4 times to use the restroom, each time requiring me to twist and contort to let her pass. There was a meal service on that flight, but it was economy class. A small tray with a sealed container. The contents were, how do I put this, technically food. Lukewarm pasta with a sauce that tasted like it had been heated and reheated multiple times. A bread roll that could have doubled as a paperweight. And a small salad with a single cherry tomato that somehow managed to look both overripe and underripe at the same time. I ate some of it. Not all of it. Just enough to keep the hunger at bay. By the time that second flight landed, I had been traveling for nearly 10 hours. My body ached. My eyes were heavy, and I still had one more flight to go. But here is the thing. That last flight, the one we are here to talk about, was different. Because when I checked in for this final leg, the agent at the counter looked at my itinerary, tapped a few keys on her keyboard, and told me something that made the entire day feel worth it. I had been upgraded to first class. Miles. Accumulated loyalty miles from months of travel. They had finally paid off, and the timing could not have been better. After 10 hours of cramped seats, bad food, and fluorescent lighting, I was about to board a flight where the seats were wide, the food was warm, and the service was attentive. I remember the feeling when she handed me the new boarding pass. It was a small thing, a piece of paper with a different seat number on it, but it felt like a gift. Like the universe saying, "You have had a long day. Here. Rest." So I walked to the gate with something I had not felt all day. A quiet optimism. The gate area was busy but not chaotic. Families waited with bags at their feet. Business travelers stood near the windows, phones pressed to their ears. A young couple sat together, sharing earbuds, watching something on a tablet screen. When boarding began, first class was called first. I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent. She scanned it. The machine beeped. She smiled and said, "Enjoy your flight." And just like that, I was walking down the jet bridge toward the aircraft. Now, there is something about walking down a jet bridge that I have always found strangely calming. The enclosed walkway. The slight incline. The muffled sound of the terminal behind you and the aircraft ahead. It is a transition space, a bridge between the chaos of the airport and the relative quiet of the cabin. And on that evening, after everything I had been through, that transition felt almost ceremonial. I stepped onto the aircraft and turned left. First class. The cabin was everything I had imagined. Wide leather seats arranged in a 2-2 configuration. Soft amber lighting from above. A subtle fragrance in the air, something clean and warm, like cedar or sandalwood. The overhead bins were still mostly empty, and the cabin was quiet. Only a handful of passengers had boarded so far. A flight attendant greeted me near the entrance. Warm smile. Professional posture. She glanced at my boarding pass and gestured toward my seat with an open palm. "Welcome aboard," she said. My seat was by the window. Row 3, Seat A. I placed my carry-on in the overhead bin, settled into the seat, and immediately felt the difference. The cushion was firm but soft. The armrests were wide enough to actually rest your arms on. There was a small pillow against the window and a folded blanket on the seat beside me. I adjusted the headrest, leaned back, and for the first time in over 10 hours, I felt my shoulders drop. Other passengers began filing in. A man in a dark suit took the seat across the aisle. He set down a leather briefcase, pulled out a laptop, and began typing immediately. Behind me, a woman in a cream-colored sweater was arranging her things in the seat pocket. Ahead of me, an older gentleman was already reading a newspaper, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. Everyone moved with that quiet efficiency that first-class passengers seem to have. No fumbling. No confusion. Just smooth, practiced motions. A flight attendant came by with a tray of pre-departure drinks. Orange juice. Water. Champagne in a slender flute. I took the water. My mouth was dry from the recycled cabin air of the previous flights, and something cold and simple was all I needed. The doors closed. The captain came on the intercom with the usual greeting. Flight time. Altitude. Weather at our destination. All standard. All unremarkable. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. The engines hummed louder. The plane taxied slowly to the runway, and within a few minutes, I felt that familiar press of acceleration against my back as we lifted into the sky. Through the window, I watched the city fall away below. Streets became ribbons of light. Buildings became clusters of tiny glowing boxes. And then clouds rolled in, and the world below disappeared entirely. Above the clouds, the sky was dark and vast. No moon that night, or at least none visible from my side of the aircraft. Just darkness and the faint reflection of the cabin lights in the window glass. It was quiet. Genuinely, beautifully quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over you and makes the tension in your body start to melt. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, but just to exist in that stillness. To appreciate it. After a day of noise and movement and discomfort, the silence of that first-class cabin felt like medicine. And then, about 30 minutes into the flight, the meal service began. Now, I had been looking forward to this. Not in a dramatic way. I was not obsessing over the menu or counting the minutes. But after a day of bad food and missed meals, the thought of a proper dinner, served on real plates, with real silverware, in a quiet and comfortable setting, was deeply appealing. I could see the flight attendants preparing in the galley at the front of the cabin. The soft clatter of plates being arranged. The quiet opening and closing of compartments. A cart being loaded and positioned. It was the choreography of meal service, and in first class, it was practiced and precise. The first trays went out to the front rows. White linen cloths placed on tray tables. A small appetizer plate. Then the main dish, covered with a metal dome. Warm bread offered from a cloth-lined basket. A small dish of butter. A drink refreshed. Each interaction was quiet and courteous. A nod. A thank you. A brief exchange about the wine selection. I watched it all unfold from row 3, waiting my turn. Row 1. Served. Row 2. Served. And then the cart reached my row. No one on that flight could have guessed that a simple meal service would soon create one of the most uncomfortable moments in the cabin. But that is exactly what happened. And it started the moment that cart rolled past my seat without stopping. But before we get to that moment, before the cart, before the silence, before the confrontation, I want you to understand one more thing about that cabin. One more detail that matters. When I sat in that seat, seat 3A, window side, second row from the front, I was the only person in first class who had been upgraded. Everyone else had purchased their tickets outright. Full fare, first class tickets. I knew this not because I asked, but because of the subtle differences in the way passengers settled in. The ones who fly first class regularly have a rhythm to it. They do not look around the cabin with quiet wonder. They do not touch the armrests like they are discovering them for the first time. They sit down, adjust their settings, pull out their devices, and exist as if this is simply how travel works. I was not like that. I was the one who took an extra moment to appreciate the seat. The one who ran my hand along the leather armrest. The one who noticed the stitching on the pillow. The one who looked out the window during takeoff with the kind of attention that regular first-class flyers abandoned years ago. And I wonder, now, if that is something the crew noticed too. If the flight attendant with the tight bun and the service list looked at me and saw something that told her I did not belong. Not consciously, perhaps. Not with intention. But with the kind of quiet, automatic judgment that people make without realizing they are making it. The judgment that says, this person is different. This person is not one of the regulars. This person is an upgrade. And maybe, that judgment is what landed my name at the bottom of the list. The expendable one. The one who could go without. I do not know that for certain. I may never know. But the thought crossed my mind as I sat in that cabin, surrounded by meals I was not allowed to have, and it has never fully left. Because when a system fails, it rarely fails randomly. It fails along the lines of least resistance. It fails in the direction of the person with the least power, the least history, the least perceived importance. And on that flight, that person was me. The cart moved past my row the way a car moves past a house it has no business stopping at. Smooth. Deliberate. Without hesitation. The flight attendant, the same one who had greeted passengers at the door, the one with the tight bun and the crisp uniform and the smile that never quite reached her eyes, guided the cart past my seat and continued to the row behind me. I watched her stop at row 4. I watched her lay down the white linen cloth. I watched her place the tray. I watched her offer the bread basket with the same practiced grace she had shown every other passenger. And I sat there. Empty table. Empty tray. Empty hands. Now, let me tell you what goes through your mind in a moment like that. It is not anger. Not at first. The first thing you feel is confusion. A quiet, nagging sense that something does not add up. You replay the last few seconds in your mind. Did I miss something? Did she say something I did not hear? Was there a reason the cart moved past me that I somehow failed to register? And then you do what any reasonable person would do. You tell yourself it is a mistake. Of course it is a mistake. It has to be. Why would everyone in first class receive a meal except me? There is no logical reason. There is no policy, no rule, no fine print on a boarding pass that says this passenger does not eat. It is a mistake. A simple, easily correctable oversight. So I waited. I waited because I did not want to be the person who overreacts. I did not want to press the call button 30 seconds after being skipped and make a scene. I thought, give it a minute. They will notice. They will come back. They will realize they missed a seat and correct it. 1 minute passed. The flight attendant was now serving row 5. The last row in first class. She placed the tray. Offered the bread. Refreshed the drink. Smiled. 2 minutes passed. The service was over. The cart was being wheeled back to the galley. The flight attendant disappeared behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. And I was still sitting there. Without a meal. Without an explanation. 3 minutes. 4 minutes. 5 minutes. Around me, the cabin had transformed into a quiet dining room. The sound of forks against plates. The gentle tear of bread. The soft clink of ice in glasses. The low murmur of passengers exchanging a few words between bites. And in the middle of all of it, one seat sat in silence. Mine. I looked down at my tray table. It was still folded up. Still clean. Still waiting. Like a table set for a guest who was never invited. That is when I pressed the call button. The overhead chime was soft but distinct. A single tone that cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. I saw the small orange light above my seat flicker on. And I waited. About 30 seconds later, the flight attendant appeared. She walked toward my seat with that same measured pace. That same professional posture. That same expression that was polite but not particularly warm. She stopped at the edge of my row and looked at me with a slight tilt of her head, as if to say, yes? I spoke quietly. Calmly. I told her that I had not received my meal during the service and asked if there had been some kind of oversight. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the small clipboard she had tucked under her arm. A printed sheet. The service list. Rows of names and seat numbers, presumably matching passengers to their meal selections. She scanned the list with her index finger, moving down the page line by line. And then she stopped. Her finger rested on a line, my line, I assumed, and her expression shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that most people would notice. But I noticed. A slight tightening around the eyes. A brief pause before she spoke. And then she said it. According to the service list, I was not scheduled to receive a meal. She said it simply. Without apology. Without surprise. As if she were reading a gate number or a departure time. Just a fact, delivered with the same flat, professional tone she might use to explain that the lavatory was occupied or that the seatbelt sign was still on. Not scheduled to receive a meal. The words landed heavily. Not because they were loud. Not because they were aggressive. But because they made absolutely no sense. I was in seat 3A. A confirmed first-class seat. On a flight where every other first-class passenger had just been served a full, multi-course dinner. And according to this woman and her printed list, I was not supposed to eat. I looked at her for a moment, waiting for some kind of clarification. A follow-up. An explanation. Something. She offered none. So I asked. Politely. Directly. I asked why I was not on the list when every other first-class passenger was. I asked if there had been a catering error. I asked if there was perhaps a different list she could check. I asked these questions the way you ask questions when you are trying very hard to remain calm, even though every instinct in your body is telling you that something is fundamentally wrong. Her response was brief. She said she would check with the lead flight attendant and return to the galley. And while she was gone, something happened that made the situation feel 10 times more uncomfortable. People noticed. The man in the suit across the aisle had stopped eating. His fork was resting on the edge of his plate, and he was looking at me. Not staring. Just looking. The kind of look that says, I heard that, and I am not sure what to make of it. The woman in the cream-colored sweater behind me had leaned forward slightly in her seat. Not to eavesdrop, she did not need to. The flight attendant had not been loud, but in a cabin that quiet, words carry. Sound travels differently at 35,000 feet. The hum of the engines provides a constant backdrop, but voices, especially clear, deliberate ones, cut right through it. And the older gentleman ahead of me, the one with the newspaper, had turned his head slightly. Not all the way around. Just enough to acknowledge that he had heard something unusual. 3 passengers. 3 sets of eyes. 3 people who had been quietly enjoying their meals and were now aware that something was off. That is the thing about awkward moments in small spaces. They do not stay contained. They expand. They fill the room. They seep into the awareness of everyone nearby until the silence itself becomes loud. And in that moment, the silence in my row was deafening. I sat there, my tray table still folded, my hands resting on the armrests, and I waited. I waited for the flight attendant to return with an explanation, a correction, a plate of food, anything that would make this strange situation disappear. But when she came back, her expression had not changed. She told me she had spoken with the lead. She told me the list was correct. She told me that there appeared to have been some kind of issue with the catering order, and that unfortunately, there was no additional meal available for my seat. No additional meal available. Let me say that again, because I need you to understand the absurdity of what was happening. I was sitting in a first-class cabin, surrounded by passengers who were actively eating multi-course dinners. Dinners that were included with their tickets. Dinners that were a standard, expected part of the first-class experience. And I was being told, to my face, that there was no food for me. Not that there was a delay. Not that there had been a mix-up that would be corrected. Not that someone was working on a solution. Just, no. You do not get a meal. The flight attendant stood there for another moment, as if waiting for me to accept this. As if the conversation was over. As if the simple act of delivering bad news was sufficient, and no further action was required. I did not accept it. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I did not make a scene. But I looked at her directly and I asked one more question. A question that I felt deserved an answer. I asked, how is it possible that there are enough meals for every first-class passenger on this aircraft except one? She did not have an answer for that. And that moment, that brief, suspended moment where a flight attendant in a crisp uniform stood beside a first-class passenger's empty seat and had no explanation for why they were the only person not being fed, that moment was the beginning of something that no one on that flight expected. Because I was not the only one asking that question anymore. The man in the suit had set down his fork entirely. He was watching the exchange now. Not hiding it. Not pretending to look elsewhere. Just watching, with a quiet intensity that made it clear he had opinions about what was happening. The woman behind me shifted in her seat. I could feel it. The subtle movement of someone adjusting their position to better observe what was unfolding nearby. And the older gentleman ahead of me, the one with the newspaper, had folded it closed and placed it on the empty seat beside him. The cabin had been a quiet, comfortable space just minutes ago. Now it was something else entirely. The food was the same. The lighting was the same. The hum of the engines was the same. But the energy had shifted. The air felt different. Heavier. Like the pressure had changed, even though we were still cruising at the same altitude. And in the galley, behind the curtain, I could hear voices. Low voices. The flight attendant who had spoken to me. Another crew member. Maybe two. They were discussing something, and even though I could not make out the words, the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of people who knew something was wrong. And they were trying to figure out what to do about it. But let me stay in this moment a little longer. Because I want you to feel what I felt. Not just the facts of what happened, those are straightforward enough. I want you to feel the texture of it. The weight. The way it sat on my skin like humidity. Imagine sitting at a dinner table. A long one. Beautifully set. White tablecloths, polished silverware, candles flickering. And every seat at that table has a plate in front of it. Every seat has a glass of wine. Every seat has a folded napkin and a warm piece of bread and a dish that smells like care and attention and effort. Every seat except yours. Your place at the table has nothing. No plate. No glass. No napkin. Just the bare tablecloth and the reflection of candlelight on an empty surface. And when you ask the host why your setting is missing, they look at you, politely, professionally, without a trace of hostility, and they tell you that according to their list, you were not expected to eat. That is what it felt like. Not violent. Not aggressive. Not even openly rude. Just a quiet, systematic exclusion that was somehow more unsettling than any of those things. Because rudeness, you can confront. Aggression, you can resist. But exclusion that comes wrapped in professionalism, exclusion that is delivered with a smile and a clipboard, that is the kind that crawls under your skin and stays there. You start to question yourself. That is the insidious part. You start to wonder if maybe you did something wrong. Maybe you missed a step in the booking process. Maybe you were supposed to pre-select a meal and forgot. Maybe your upgrade came with different terms. Maybe the fine print of your fare class says something about meal eligibility that you overlooked. Your mind reaches for explanations that make the situation your fault, because if it is your fault, then it makes sense. If it is your fault, then the system is not broken. If it is your fault, then the world is still fair and ordered and predictable, and you just made a mistake. But then you look around the cabin, and you see 12 other passengers. 12 other first-class seats. And every single one of them has a meal. Every one. And you know in your gut, in your bones, in the part of your brain that processes truth before your conscious mind has time to rationalize, you know that this is not your fault. Something happened. A decision was made. And that decision landed on you. That is the moment the confusion turns into something else. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. More focused. A determination to understand. To get answers. To not let this moment pass without acknowledgement. And that determination is what carried me through the rest of that flight. What began as a small inconvenience was now becoming something much larger. And the worst part was the silence. Not the silence of the cabin, that had already been broken. Not the silence of the engines, those hummed on as they always did. But the silence of explanation. The absence of any coherent reason for why this was happening. That silence was the loudest thing on the aircraft. Let me paint the picture for you, because I want you to understand exactly what this looked like from the inside. I am sitting in row 3, seat A. My tray table is folded up. My armrests are bare. There is no plate in front of me. No glass. No linen cloth. Nothing. I am sitting in a first-class seat that looks like it belongs in a different cabin entirely, stripped of everything that makes first class what it is. And around me, in every direction, people are eating. The man in the suit across the aisle has his plate still in front of him, though he has stopped eating. His chicken is half finished. His bread is torn but mostly untouched. His glass of red wine sits near the edge of his tray, catching the amber light of the cabin. Behind me, the woman in the cream-colored sweater has finished her appetizer and is waiting for her main course. I can hear the soft scrape of her plate being cleared by a flight attendant who moves with that particular blend of efficiency and politeness that you only find at 35,000 feet. The older gentleman ahead of me is eating slowly, methodically, the way some people do when they are alone and in no rush. His newspaper is still folded beside him. His reading glasses are still perched on his nose. But every now and then, every 30 seconds or so, his eyes flicker toward me. Not staring. Just checking. Like someone watching a situation they expect to get worse. And it did. Because about 10 minutes after my initial conversation with the flight attendant, something changed. The crew, the 2 or 3 flight attendants working the first-class cabin, began behaving differently. Their movements, which had been smooth and confident during the meal service, were now quicker. More deliberate. They moved between the galley and the curtain with the kind of urgency that suggested conversations were happening behind the scenes. I could see them gathering near the galley. 2 at first, then 3. They stood close together, speaking in voices too low to hear from my seat. But their body language told me everything I needed to know. Heads close together. Quick glances toward the cabin. One of them, a younger crew member I had not spoken to, looked directly at me for a brief moment before turning back to the others. They were talking about me. That realization sits differently when you are the person in the center of it. When you are the one people are whispering about. When you are sitting in a room full of strangers, watching the staff of the very service you are paying for huddle together and discuss your situation as if you are a problem to be managed rather than a passenger to be served. It is isolating. That is the only word for it. In a cabin full of people, surrounded by the sounds of dining and quiet conversation, I felt completely alone. Not because no one was paying attention to me, the opposite, in fact. Several passengers were now clearly aware that something was happening. But their awareness only made it worse. Because it meant I was not just missing a meal. I was a spectacle. An anomaly. The one person in first class who was not being treated like everyone else. And still, no one had explained why. After what felt like a long time but was probably about 5 minutes, the lead flight attendant came to my seat. She was different from the first one. Slightly older. A different tone in her voice, warmer, but measured. The kind of tone you use when you are trying to diffuse something. She introduced herself by her first name, which I will not share here, and told me she understood there had been an issue with my meal service. I waited for her to continue. She told me that the catering order for this flight had included a specific number of first-class meals, and that unfortunately, one fewer meal had been loaded onto the aircraft than the number of first-class passengers. A catering error, she said. Something that had happened before the aircraft left the gate. Not a decision made on board. Not anyone's fault in the cabin. Just a logistical mistake on the ground. She said it with the kind of sincerity that suggested she believed what she was saying. And maybe she did. But there was a problem with her explanation. A big problem. Because if the catering company had loaded one fewer meal than the number of first-class passengers, then someone had to decide who would not receive one. Meals do not distribute themselves. Someone, whether on the ground or in the air, had to look at a list of names and seat numbers and make a choice. This person gets food. This person does not. And somehow, every single time, no matter how you sliced it, the answer to who does not get a meal landed on me. Not the man in the suit. Not the woman in the cream sweater. Not the older gentleman with the newspaper. Me. I asked her this. Politely. Directly. I asked how the decision had been made. Who had determined that my seat, out of all the seats in first class, would be the one to go without? She hesitated. It was a small hesitation. A fraction of a second. The kind that most people would not notice. But I noticed. Because when you are sitting in a seat that has been singled out for exclusion, you notice everything. Every pause. Every glance. Every shift in posture. She told me she was not sure. She told me the list had been prepared before she boarded. She told me she would file a report and make sure the airline was aware of the situation. A report. A report. I was sitting in a first-class cabin, watching every other passenger enjoy a meal that I was entitled to, and the solution being offered was a report. Not a meal. Not a voucher. Not a genuine, in-the-moment correction. A report. Paperwork. Something that would be filed, reviewed, and almost certainly forgotten by the time the aircraft was cleaned and turned around for its next flight. I do not know if you have ever been in a situation where someone acknowledges that something wrong has happened to you and then offers you nothing of substance to fix it. It is a particular kind of frustration. Because it is not outright denial. It is not hostility. It is something almost worse. It is the appearance of care without the reality of it. It is a performance. A checkbox being ticked. Passenger informed. Issue acknowledged. Moving on. But the cabin was not moving on. Because while I was having this conversation with the lead flight attendant, the other passengers in first class had been watching. And now some of them were beginning to react. The man in the suit, I keep coming back to him because he was the most visible, had pushed his tray slightly to the side and was sitting upright in his seat, watching the exchange with an expression I can only describe as alert. Like a lawyer in a courtroom watching testimony he finds dubious. And then he did something I did not expect. He spoke. Not to me. To the lead flight attendant. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, because these are not exact quotes, he said something along the lines of, "This does not seem right. This person has a first-class ticket like everyone else. Why are they the only one without a meal?" His voice was calm. Measured. But firm. The kind of voice that comes from someone who is used to being heard when he speaks. The lead flight attendant turned to him with that same composed expression. She thanked him for his concern. She repeated the explanation about the catering error. She assured him that the matter would be addressed. He did not look satisfied. And he was not the only one. The woman in the cream sweater, who had been listening to the entire exchange, caught my eye and gave me a small nod. Not a dramatic gesture. Just a quiet acknowledgement. A look that said, "I see what is happening, and it is not okay." Even the older gentleman ahead of me, the one who had been eating so quietly and calmly, paused and looked over his shoulder. His expression was hard to read, but it was not indifferent. Something behind his eyes suggested disapproval. Or maybe disappointment. Like he had expected better. The lead flight attendant retreated to the galley. And the tension, which had been building quietly, steadily, like air being pumped into a balloon, did not deflate. It just hung there. Present. Visible. Felt by everyone in the cabin, whether they were involved or not. Minutes passed. The cabin lights dimmed. This was the natural progression of the flight, meal service over, lights lowered, passengers encouraged to rest. One by one, trays were cleared. Linen cloths were collected. Overhead bins clicked shut as people settled in for sleep. But sleep did not come easily to that cabin. At least not to the people who had witnessed what happened. I could feel it. That restless energy. The kind that fills a room after a confrontation that was never resolved. People shifting in their seats. The man in the suit typing something on his phone. The woman behind me adjusting her blanket more times than necessary. And me. I sat in my seat, tray table still folded, staring out the window at nothing. Because there was nothing to see. Just darkness. Just clouds. Just the faint reflection of my own face in the glass, looking back at me with an expression I did not recognize at first. It was the expression of someone who had just been made to feel invisible in a room full of people. And that feeling, that quiet, gnawing, deeply uncomfortable feeling of being singled out, excluded, and then told there was nothing to be done about it, that feeling did not go away. It grew. It grew with every passing minute. With every glance from a fellow passenger. With every whispered conversation from the galley. With every moment of silence that was not really silence at all, but a room full of people processing something they had never seen before. And in the darkness of that cabin, as the aircraft hummed through the night sky, something shifted. Not in me. In the crew. Because somewhere between the dimming of the lights and the beginning of the descent, the flight attendants stopped coming through the cabin altogether. The curtain between first class and economy stayed closed. The galley went dark. And the crew, the people whose job it was to make passengers feel comfortable, became ghosts. Invisible. Absent. Silent. And that silence, the silence of a crew that knew something had gone very wrong and had no idea how to fix it, that silence spoke louder than anything that had been said all night. Let me tell you what silence sounds like at 35,000 feet when something has gone wrong. It does not sound like nothing. It sounds like the engines. The constant, droning hum that you stop noticing after the first 20 minutes of any flight. That hum becomes the soundtrack of the silence. It fills the cabin the way background music fills a restaurant, not to add something, but to mask the absence of something else. Conversation. Laughter. The normal, human sounds of a space occupied by people who are at ease. None of those sounds existed in that cabin anymore. After the lights dimmed, I sat in my seat and I counted the minutes. Not because I was timing anything, but because counting gave me something to do. Something to focus on besides the empty space on my tray table and the full plates being cleared from every seat around me. 14 minutes after the lights went down, the last tray was collected. A flight attendant, not the one who had spoken to me, but another one, younger, quieter, moved through the cabin with a garbage bag, collecting napkins and bread wrappers and empty cups. She moved quickly, efficiently, her eyes fixed on the task. She did not look at me as she passed my row. She did not pause. She moved through the space where my tray should have been as though the seat were empty. As though I were not there. 22 minutes after the lights went down, the cabin was almost entirely still. Most passengers had reclined their seats and pulled their blankets up. A few reading lights glowed here and there, small circles of amber in the dim cabin. The man in the suit was still awake, his face lit by the blue glow of his phone screen. His thumbs moved across the keyboard with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was writing something important. 37 minutes after the lights went down, I heard footsteps in the galley. 2 sets. Quiet voices. The click of a compartment opening and closing. Then nothing. Then footsteps again, moving back toward the economy section. Then the curtain swishing closed. An hour after the lights went down, I gave up on the idea that anyone was coming to make this right. Not on the flight, anyway. Whatever resolution this situation was going to have, it was not going to happen in the air. It was going to happen on the ground. After landing. In the light of day, with witnesses and records and a paper trail that could not be shrugged away with a polite smile and a promise to file a report. And in that moment, that quiet, private moment in the dark, I made a decision. I was not going to let this go. Not because of the meal. A meal is just food. Calories. A few minutes of eating that you forget about by the time you brush your teeth. I was not going to let this go because of what the meal represented. It represented the basic contract between a service provider and a customer. You pay for something. You receive it. That is how it works. That is how it is supposed to work. And when it does not work, when one person is excluded from what everyone else receives, for no stated reason, with no attempt at correction, then something more fundamental than dinner has been broken. Trust has been broken. And trust, once broken, is not repaired by a report. So I sat in my seat, in the dark, with the engines humming and the cabin sleeping and the crew hiding behind their curtain, and I waited. I waited for the descent. I waited for the landing. I waited for the moment when the doors would open and the artificial world of that aircraft would give way to the real one. Because in the real world, silence is not a strategy. In the real world, you cannot retreat to a galley and hope the problem goes away. In the real world, actions have consequences. And the consequences of what happened on that flight were about to become very, very real. Now, before we get to what happened when the plane landed, I need to pause for a moment. Because if this story is resonating with you, if you are sitting there right now feeling frustrated, or uncomfortable, or outraged on behalf of someone you have never met, then I need you to do something for me. I need you to subscribe to this channel. Not because I am asking for a favor. Not because it costs you anything. But because stories like this one matter. Stories about how people are treated. Stories about what happens when fairness is ignored and accountability disappears. These are the stories that need to be told, and this channel is where we tell them. Every week. Without filters. Without sponsors influencing the narrative. Just the truth, told the way it deserves to be told. So if you have not already, hit that subscribe button right now. It takes 1 second, and it means you will never miss another story like this one. Do it now, before we continue, because what happens next is something you do not want to miss. And while you are at it, I want to ask you something. I want to hear from you. In the comments below this video, tell me this: have you ever been in a situation where you were treated differently from everyone around you, and no one could give you a real explanation? Maybe it was on a flight. Maybe it was at a restaurant. Maybe it was at work, or at school, or in a store. A moment where you were singled out, and no one could tell you why. I want to hear your story. Because I know I am not the only one who has experienced something like this. Drop your experience in the comments. Let us start a conversation. Now, let us get back to the flight. Because we are approaching the landing. And what happened when that aircraft touched the ground changed everything. Hours passed. The cabin stayed dark. The engines hummed their constant, monotonous tune. Passengers around me had settled into various states of rest, some sleeping, some staring at screens, some simply sitting with their eyes closed, existing in that strange liminal space between wakefulness and sleep that long flights create. I did not sleep. I could not. My mind would not stop turning over what had happened. The missed meal. The explanation that was not really an explanation. The flight attendant's clipboard. The lead's polished but hollow assurance that a report would be filed. The man in the suit's intervention. The woman's quiet nod. The crew's gradual disappearance. Every detail played on a loop, and each time it replayed, a new question surfaced. Why me? Out of everyone in first class, why was I the one excluded? Was it truly a catering error, one missing meal, one unlucky seat, or was there something more deliberate at work? And if it was a mistake, why had no one tried harder to fix it? Surely there was food on this aircraft. Surely a first-class cabin had access to something, an economy meal, a snack, anything, that could have been offered as even a basic gesture of apology. But nothing had been offered. Not a single thing. And that is what bothered me most. Not the hunger. Not the embarrassment. But the total absence of effort. When a company makes a mistake, when a service fails, the response to that failure tells you everything you need to know about the values of the people behind it. A genuine response says, "We messed up, and here is what we are doing about it." An empty response says, "We messed up, and we are hoping you will forget about it." This was the second kind. And I was not going to forget about it. About 45 minutes before landing, I felt the aircraft begin to change. Not dramatically, just the subtle shifts that experienced travelers learn to recognize. A slight change in engine pitch. A gentle tilt of the nose. The barely perceptible sensation of descent. The seatbelt sign clicked on with a soft chime. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. We were beginning our initial approach. The weather at our destination was clear. The local time was given. Passengers were asked to return their seats to the upright position and stow any loose items. Standard procedure. Standard words. But nothing about this flight felt standard anymore. As the cabin lights slowly brightened, passengers began stirring. The man in the suit closed his laptop and slid it into his briefcase. The woman behind me folded her blanket neatly and placed it on the seat. The older gentleman straightened his glasses and tucked his newspaper into the seat back pocket. People moved with that familiar pre-landing efficiency. Shoes back on. Hair checked in phone cameras. Watches adjusted to the local time zone. But I noticed something.